We welcome all of you back today to Shaboom. I'm your host, Rick K. Jones, and we are so glad that you've joined us today. Today, we're going to have some fun talking about the media. You know, our generation arguably saw more changes in media in our lifetimes than any others. Just staggering changes in media that we lived through and continue to live through today. You know, when I was a kid, print media was still really, really big, and really was big 50s, 60s on into the 70s. Not many people remember print media anymore. Remember those things called newspapers? They actually came to your door, and you got a little ink on your hands when you read them. Newspapers were really big. I grew up in Atlanta. We had two papers. We had the morning paper, which was the Atlanta Constitution, and we had the afternoon paper called the Atlanta Journal. The sports editor of the Atlanta Journal was a guy named Furman Bisher, and he was one of my favorite writers ever. He was one of my dad's heroes, one of my dad's favorite writers. He was tremendous. We had another sports writer in the Atlanta Constitution that had gone away to be the sports editor of the Chicago Sun-Times. His name was Louis Grizzard, and he was encouraged to come back to Atlanta, to the Constitution, and write a daily column just about whatever he wanted to write. And he was really a Southern humorist, and he had a phenomenal career and a lot of books. We lost him with heart disease way too early, but he was quite the writer. And then there was a guy named Ron Hudspeth. Ron Hudspeth wrote for the Atlanta, for the Journal. He wrote the nightlife column about the nightclubs and restaurants and watering holes and all this kind of stuff. And he was very powerful because his column could make or break a place. And he was the man about town and all this kind of stuff. Well, there's this great story. The watering hole where all the newspaper guys went to was on Peachtree Street. It was a place called Harrison's. And Harrison's was a really nice bar. It wasn't a dive bar. It was a very, very nice bar. And that's where everybody kind of hung out. The movers and shakers in the media were always in and out of Harrison's. Well, turns out we have a snowstorm in Atlanta. And Ron Hudspeth leaves the office early to go to Harrison's. Well, when he gets there, Harrison's is closed because of the snowstorm. He doesn't know what to do, and he sees a place open across the street. Let me tell you about that place. There was a guy named Doug McCarrow who sunk his entire life savings in opening a casual steakhouse on Peachtree Street. This was an unusual steakhouse in that it was very casual. In fact, when you came in, they had peanuts, unshelled peanuts that you could eat as an appetizer for no cost while you waited on your drinks or waited on your food, and you could just throw the shells literally on the floor. Somebody come in and sweep them up later on. Well, nobody came. Doug McCarrow was a week away from closing, losing his life savings. Enter Ron Hudspeth. Harrison's is closed. He looks across the street and sees this place is open. And he comes over and he drinks and eats and has a great time and writes about it. Longhorn steaks. Yes, that Longhorn steaks. The Longhorn steaks that Doug McCarrow sold for hundreds of millions of dollars later to Darden Restaurant Group. That was the first one. Would have been the last one if it hadn't been for Ron Hudspeth and the power of the media that drove people into Longhorn steaks. And as we like to say, the rest is history. Magazines were big back then. Life magazine, Time magazine, People magazine. My favorite, and continues to be one of my favorites today, is Sports Illustrated. Sports Illustrated had amazing writers. I mean, amazing writers. Rick Riley, Curry Kirkpatrick, Alexander Wolf. These guys were just giants of writing. My favorite was a guy named Frank DeFord. Frank DeFord was a great writer. He wrote a column that I still have a copy of from January of 1981 on Bob Knight called Chasing Rabbits. At that time, Indiana was struggling in January, but they went on to win the national championship in March with Isaiah Thomas and some others in Philadelphia. That was the first Final Four that I went to. And very interesting, writer, fascinating guy, larger than life, one of my favorites. Today, Sports Illustrated still exists. I think it's in its fourth owner now. And they still specialize in long format, in-depth articles about sports people. They don't have scores or any of that stuff. You get those instantly on your phone. This is all about the depth of articles, and it's still some great writing. A lot of people don't like to read anymore, I don't think. But my generation really loved to read and loved to read long format articles in magazines and in the newspapers. I still read long format articles in Wall Street Journal, which is one of the few newspapers that's kind of left that has that style. In the 1950s, radio was still king in a big, big way. We had a thing called AM radio. You may remember AM radio. You listen to your transistor radio, and you would listen to AM, Quixie and Dixie, and all kinds of other things. And then in my generation came along this phenomenon known as FM radio. Early FM was kind of hippie radio. It was countercultural radio. It was different. A lot of it sprang out of colleges, where a lot of colleges and universities had FM radio stations for the first time. I can remember listening to WRAS in Atlanta, which was Georgia State's radio station, Georgia State University's. And I remember one night listening, and this guy had a debut album by a group called America, and listened to the entire album and went out and bought the album. That was the power of that. Sports. You got sports on radio. Television was limited. You had one Major League Baseball game a week. You had one college football game in the country a week. The NCAA felt that if people watched it on TV, they wouldn't go to the games, which totally was so bogus, because later that grew attendance even better as you got to know these teams around the country. But anyway, there were two larger-than-life sports casters in Atlanta. I was a Georgia Tech fan. There was a guy named Al Seraldo. And at Georgia, there was a guy named Larry Munson, who was truly a legend Hall of Famer announcer that was just, must listen to radio, listening to the Georgia Bulldogs with Larry Munson. I'll tell you a quick story about Al Seraldo. My dad could do a pretty good Al Seraldo imitation. And I'm the basketball coach at Swanee. We'd played in a tournament over the weekend. It's Monday morning early. The phone rings early. I answer it. The guy goes, Rick, Coach Jones, it's Al Seraldo. And I said, Dad, I'm tired. I got in late. I'll call you later. And I hung up. And then I lay there a minute and said, oh, my goodness, we played Georgia Tech this week. This may have been Al Seraldo. 5 minutes later, phone rings back. Coach Jones, it's Al Seraldo. And then I told him the story, and he laughed. He loved the story and did my interview and all that. So it was pretty crazy time. We had a morning drive DJ named Gary McKee, who recently passed away, who was the guy. He was the god of morning drive radio. Morning drive radio was huge because you're stuck in your car in Atlanta traffic, and you're listening to traffic and weather and news and listening to music and comedy and all kinds of things in that. My guest today, Neil Williamson, worked with Gary McKee doing the sports shorts on WQXI 94Q. There was a country a country DJ named Rhubarb Jones. His real name was Warren Jones, and believe it or not, he was my cousin. Our grandfathers were brothers. And Warren Jones, Rhubarb Jones, was a monster country DJ in Atlanta during that particular era. But of course, the juggernaut was television. I mean, television came of age in the 1950s, 1960s, 1950s with all kinds of shows, 1960s with color shows, color TV. I can remember when we had black and white TV with those antlers, you had those antennas to pick up stations and crazy stuff like that. But we later got a color television, and then one of the first TV shows that you watched was The Wonderful World of Color, which was Disney, and the Disney stories and all that kind of stuff that went on. TV, there's never been a medium quite like it to aggregate people. The 1956 Summer Olympic Games were held in Melbourne. A lot of people think the Olympics don't have signage in their venues because of purity. That's bullshit. It's not, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with commercial value. They always had signage at the Olympic Games until when? 1956, when the television broadcaster said, I don't want to compete against the signage. If there's no signage, they'll buy more advertising. And that led to the purity of the Olympic Games, which is all about commercial value. We've talked before about the 1959 NFL championship game, the overtime game between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants. That led to the explosion of the NFL. The 1960 presidential debates, first political debates I remember, I was a 6-year-old, John Kennedy versus the vice president, Richard Nixon. Nixon kind of had a 5 o'clock shadow, and he sweated. Kennedy was good looking, cool, calm, and collected, really made the difference in the election. Kennedy was the new, the young, even though they were the same age, believe it or not. Nixon looked old and tired, and the results were history. Then we had, obviously, the most horrid day in American history, probably, the assassination of John Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. I was in the 4th grade. I remember the teachers crying in the school. We saw it all happen on television, including the funeral with the caisson and the 2 young children of John Kennedy, John Jr. and Caroline, walking with their mother, John saluting his dad. Poignant moment on television. We watched Vietnam on TV every night at 6 p.m. Every night. The lead story was how many deaths we were having in Vietnam. We saw 2 funerals, Martin Luther King's funeral and Robert Kennedy's funeral in 1968, both being assassinated. And then we had a joy. We saw the moon landing. Remember? We all watched the moon landing on television in July of 1969. And then we watched the last episode of a situation comedy called MASH, which was the largest rated entertainment show ever in the history of television. TV made the Masters, it made the NCAA Final Four, it made so much more. You know, Arnold Palmer was the perfect personality for golf. And Arnold Palmer, with the Masters, with television, led to the explosion of televised golf. We only had 3 channels, ABC, NBC, CBS. And so you had a show and you gathered all sorts of audiences through that. And then what did we live through? The explosion. Cable television, Ted Turner pioneered it with the stations up on the satellite that could be beamed anywhere, and then the growth of things like ESPN. People said, nobody will watch 24-hour sports. Oh, yes, they will. And ESPN became a juggernaut. CNN was a juggernaut, led to Fox News, led to the Food Network. So many other networks that we know about were all because of cable. And suddenly we had all kinds of choices of programming on cable television. And then in our generation came this thing called the internet. You remember dial-up internet? You remember AOL? And then it would connect. And then you're on the internet, the World Wide Web, and all kinds of crazy stuff. I remember when, ding, you got mail, you were excited. You were excited to get an email. I'm not very excited about the emails I get these days. And then what came along? Social media. Social media, like first MySpace, which led to Facebook, has led to LinkedIn and other social sites. And then we had what? TikTok, YouTube, places that you could post your own content, your own videos, your own stories, all sorts of things along those lines. And that led to things like this show, podcasts, or videos like United Taste of America. And so, boy, what a change. Print to radio to TV to internet to social to you name it. It's been quite a journey. Whew. Man, that's a lot of changes to keep up with for one poor old baby boomer in one generation, but we had to do that. You remember the old model said, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, did it make any noise? Today's model, if 1 billion trees fall at the same time and we can see them all fall on digital media, how does your tree stand out? That's really the thing. Somebody told me the other day, some friends at iHeart told me the other day, that every minute there's 5,000 pieces of content posted. Every minute, 5,000 pieces of content across the world. how do you keep up with all that? So the best way to help me is tell other people about Shaboom so that they will listen to it, because it's really hard to build an audience today with so much media. Here's some great quotes about the media. Malcolm X said, "The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and make the guilty innocent." And that's power, because they control the minds of the masses. Wow. I remember Bob Knight saying one time, one of the reasons he distrusted the media so much was that his daddy got up every day, read the paper cover to cover, and believed every word in the paper. It had to be true. And so there's a level of accountability today. And candidly, we were losing some of that accountability today. I don't know what is truth and what is not. Thomas Jefferson said this: "Our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost." Jefferson knew even then, one of the founding fathers, that the strength of our country was going to be the conscience of the media, and they're reporting what really is true. We mentioned John Kennedy and his election and his assassination. He said, "There is a terrific disadvantage in not having the abrasive quality of the press applied to you daily. We could not do the job at all in a free society without a very, very active press." Yeah, they're supposed to hold political figures and other people accountable. That's their job. And finally, Albert Camus said, "A free press can, of course, be good or bad, but most certainly without freedom, the press will never be anything but bad." Boy, isn't that true? I remember going to Russia with Turner Broadcasting when I was working on the Goodwill Games. And we signed the contract with the Soviet Union. And during that period that we worked on the games, we saw the overthrow of the Soviet Union becoming back being Russia. In fact, when we first started going there, we would go to a city called Leningrad that changed its name back to St. Petersburg, its original name. When we first started going there, Russia had one word for advertising, marketing, promotion, public relations. That one word was propaganda. See, they believed all of it was bullshit, all of it. Propaganda. It shows the power of the media, that in many cases they can fool people. And I think it's really important. Speaking of the media, recently, as part of our celebration of America 250, CBS, their morning show, their Sunday morning show, Jane Pauley's show, which is a great show, promoted the 250 songs of the last 250 years. You can find all those on CBSnews.com. Look at the 250, and how many do you know? What was the number one song? "This Land Is Your Land" by the great Woody Guthrie. Our playlist today is full of great songs. Our song of the week is a song about the media. It's by Don Henley. It's called "Dirty Laundry." Pretty great song. Here's some other songs on the playlist today. Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," "All Along the Watchtower" by Jimi Hendrix, "Both Sides Now" by Joni Mitchell. And then Billy Joel has a great song that really sums up the entire baby boomer generation called "We Didn't Start the Fire." It's a great song. It'll tell you a lot about all the memories of our generation and all the things that went on. You know, one of the best parts of having a podcast and running your own podcast is to bring special guests on that were your old friends. You get reconnected with old friends, and today's no exception. My old friend Neil Williamson is here to talk about his career life in the media. He worked, as I mentioned earlier, in radio early in his career on WQXI, 94Q. Later worked for Cox Media Group in a variety of roles. Saw a lot of changes from radio to television to digital, and was kind of a key component to all that. He continues to be the host of the Georgia Bulldog show, pregame show before all the football games. Let's welcome my pal Neil Hondo Williamson now to Shaboom. Hey Neil, welcome to Shaboom.
Great to see you, Rick, and I'm honored and flattered to be on your podcast, your
Well,
vodcast.
you've been a great old friend, and you've had a wonderful career. And I think you're going to give a lot of context today as we've been talking about media and changes in media over the years. You've pretty much lived them and seen them all. But I ask every guest the first and the same first question, which is, where were you reared, and who were some of the early influencers in your life?
Oh, that's a great question. I was born in Asheville, North Carolina, and I lived there for 6 months, but I was reared in New Rochelle, New York, which is a bedroom community, Westchester County outside of New York City. My father worked in the city every day. And in New York, besides my parents and my older brother and sister, my sister's 4 years older, my brother is 8 years older. So they had great influence on my life, especially pop culture and with my brother, sports, because he was a sports nut. I would say the other greatest influences on my life were my basketball coach, Dan O'Hare, who I played under for 4 years, and he was also the baseball coach. And I was the world's worst baseball player. And even when I was in the third grade, when he came, he saw how much I loved the sports and made me one of his team managers for the varsity. So I was actually keeping stats, turnovers, and rebounds when I was in the third grade for the seventh, eighth grade team. And in baseball, I became the lead manager by the time I was in the fourth or fifth grade for JV and then varsity because I was so bad and I just loved the game so much. So um, he had a huge impact on my young life. And then I would say of all of my friends, Teddy Foley, he was funny. And he and his twin brother Tommy, who were my best friends, they listened to Cosby comedy albums, and we would listen to them once in a while. And Teddy had a quick wit. Again, three older brothers for the twins, and that was attractive to me. So I based, I think, some of my wit on him. Then
That's
when I got to
interesting.
high school, gosh, your friends in high school can stay with you through life, and there were plenty of those. But as far as teachers go, a man named John Hogan, best teacher I ever had, 3 years of Latin. I remember when I was my senior year in college at Georgia, my father said to me, "Who's the best teacher you've ever had?" And I said, "John Hogan, Mr. Hogan." He's like, "No, I mean college." I went, "I don't know, I got John Hocking in college, but my best teacher I ever had was John Hogan."
Well, again, you were a product of DeKalb County schools at a time that really meant something. There were just great teachers in DeKalb County, and teachers that I had two English teachers, Elizabeth Kyle. I mean, I can remember reading A Separate Piece and Catcher in the Rye, and just things that stuck with me so well. And I see all your books behind you. She knew I loved to read, and I would show up on a Monday, and she had another book. Rick, you need to read.
Wow.
It was that kind of thing. And then Sally Franz was another that was my ninth grade English teacher who made me read the classics. I can remember reading, Jane Austen and Charles Dickens and, lots of the classics that, you really didn't want to read them, but she had such a neat personality about making it come alive and making it relevant for today. I thought she would have been a great screenwriter, later on, taking those and making them, because she made stuffy old English novels relevant to a teenager
Yeah.
in Atlanta, Georgia. That was
I want to tell you a quick funny story is, I don't know, 15 years ago, said to myself, I saw something online, right? I went down a rabbit hole and saw the 100 best pieces of fiction of all time. And there were two different lists. One was the critics and one was the readers. So I printed them both, and probably 40 or 50 of them crossed over, right? With the readers, there was a lot more science fiction, and I'm not much of a science fiction guy. But I said to myself, I want to go through these two lists of, 150 some odd books and, take out all the science fiction. So I'm down to 120. How many have I read? And I started doing all the check marks. And when I got done, it was like 11 or 13. And I said, okay, now, how many have I actually read rather than pretended I read in high school? because I didn't really start reading until my senior year of college. And now I was down to about 6. And since then, I have been checking them off. I like to read modern fiction. I'm reading your daughter Jennifer's book right now. I like to read modern fiction as well, and a lot of historical stuff, and like Dan Kahneman, economics, freakonomics, those type of things, books. But I've gone back and made sure I've got a classic in the rotation every third book, so I can check another one off the list.
Well, it's interesting. We're living an interesting, I guess. We've always lived in interesting times. We live in a really interesting political time right now, and I've started going back and reading some historians that I have great respect for. I had read Team of Rivals before, but I went back and reread it, and I'm reading everything by John Meacham right now, who I think is a really interesting. He's got an interesting perspective on history and politics, and in a lot of ways we've seen this movie and that kind of thing. What brought you from New York to Atlanta? Did your dad got a job?
Yeah, my dad was vice president of the United Way at the home headquarters in New York, and they were going to move the headquarters to Washington, D.C., and told him you can come to D.C., or we're going to open 4 regional branches. 1, stay in New York. He didn't want to do that. 2, Chicago, too cold. 3, San Francisco. My brother and sister, older than me, both on the East Coast. They didn't want to go out there. And he loved the idea of Atlanta. He saw the potential in Atlanta. So we moved here, and I was apoplectic. 14 years old, man, coming from New York to Atlanta.
Yeah,
he's 72.
Big change.
Ooh.
Yeah.
And then, as I like to tell people, my sophomore year, by the time Dee Dee Forehand put her tongue in my mouth for the first time, I was like, oh, I like to live here.
I like Atlanta. It's like, I wish they all could be Southern girls, right? It's like, this is good. This is not bad. This is a pretty good place. So you go to Georgia.
Yep.
Did you major in communications?
I majored in speech communication. I was in journalism to start, and suffice it to say, I ran the college radio station my junior year. So I went up there my sophomore year. My junior year, they made me general manager. I had about 85 volunteer employees, a paid staff of, most of them were making $10 a week, right? A paid staff of 9 besides myself, dealing with the FCC, trying to deal with power increases and ascertainment from the university and budgets that would run out at the end of the year. I was the third of the general managers who was trying to get this done with a power increase, FCC work, and all this different stuff that I was doing, and making sure people showed up for their shifts on time, et cetera, and trying to groom people. And the J school was teaching me nothing back then, and actually had one really arrogant professor who I dropped out, moved over to speech communication. I liked 2 of my professors over there and just said, I'm not going to continue to have these people tell me that I need to know about any more about KDKA in Pittsburgh signing on in 1918 or whatever it was. And it was like the 3rd class or 4th class I had in a row that had that as one of the lead-ins. And I was like, I'm out. And it did okay.
Yeah, no, the rest is history. So you get out. Did you immediately get the radio job in Atlanta?
Yeah, 94Q. I was very blessed. Number 1 station in Atlanta, overwhelming number 1 ratings and revenue, with a top morning show. And I just caught a break. One of the guys I did college radio with knew somebody. He came back. He got the job on the weekends. They needed a new weekend guy so he could move up to 9th on the depth chart, and they needed a new 10th guy on the depth chart. He recommended me. Next thing you know, I'm on the air spinning the hits and working my way up there as well. So yeah, 94Q, WQXI in Atlanta.
Well, again, most baby boomers understand the power of what morning drive radio meant in terms of just, like you said, profitability, influence, culture. It was kind of the voice of the city. Today, in the satellite radio world, it's a lot of changes. But at that point, that was a big deal. You're in a city like Atlanta, you're the number 1 morning show. Gary McKee, who we recently lost, was an icon. I
She
mean,
was.
and then, you did a bit, the Andy Looney bits that I still think,
God, I can't believe you remember
well, listen,
those.
they're still my favorites ever. I mean, and again, I mean, you had Andy Rooney's accent down perfectly, but you were Andy
Yeah.
Looney, and you were making a commentary on some sporting event. But I mean, those were the best.
It was the NCAA brackets.
Yes, I
Like,
mean, it was.
there are 32 teams in the NCAA this year. I bet you wonder which nicknames do you see the most? I did. So I counted them. So I counted them. There are 3 Tigers. Fairfield is in the tournament. They're the Stags. I wonder if they have like kegs of beer and strippers at their pep rallies. It's
They
just,
were. Oh God, they
I
were
can't
great.
believe you remember that. That's
Oh God,
40 years ago.
listen, Gary McKee did a pep rally for me at Georgia Tech. We were playing Auburn with Bo Jackson.
Mhm.
And I was the idiot that printed up, 20,000 buttons that said Bo no go. The first half, he had 14 yards rushing, and I'm feeling pretty damn good about myself. The second half, he had 318 yards rushing,
Yeah.
4 touchdowns, and
Yeah.
everybody's throwing those damn buttons at me. But he did the pep rally, and I'll never forget, he came out and he said, well, those Auburn fans are going to be driving up I-85 on their tractors with their polyester pantsuits. I mean, he really had a fun time, but he was the one that said, if you go to Auburn, you can put your Auburn diploma on the dashboard of your car and park in the handicapped parking spaces. it, was a great line, but there were probably more Auburn graduates living in Atlanta than Georgia Tech graduates, so he really didn't understand his audience. But that was such a monster. We're never going to see that. That was an era.
Oh yeah.
Just like we're not going to see Thursday Night Seinfeld doing 20 6 points, and it just was different. So you saw a lot of changes in media. We worked together in the agency business at one time. Then you went back to WSB and had a long, and WSB, I always felt like Cox, the speed of the ship is always determined by the speed of the captain. And we're not going to see that era anymore either. What I call the kind of the family owned, empire that own newspapers, own TV stations, own radio stations. Talk a little bit about that experience and getting there and kind of that culture and what that meant to you.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up. I have a Halberstam book back here. I can't remember the title of it that I read that was about the L.A. Times family and 3 or 4 of the other big media families. It's been 15 years since I read it, but yeah, the Cox family I owe so much to. They were fantastic. In fact, I interacted with Alex Taylor, who's the current chief executive officer of Cox not long ago in the past week or so. They were fantastic. They treated all of their employees so well, and not to think that they don't now. But yeah, they own the AJC. They own the #1 ABC TV affiliate in America, which is Channel 2 in Atlanta. Now, it is nowhere near the power it did even 7 or 8 years ago. But from 25 years ago until about 7 years ago, it was a monster TV station. Its local news ratings outperformed any other ABC affiliate in the country. And of course, it owned the radio stations that I worked for, 5 radio stations, including a WSBAM, which was AM 750, and we added an FM signal around 2011, I think, at 95.5. And again, our ratings and revenue were insane. I heard somebody say that we were this is about 15, 20 years ago, and I was marketing director then. Oh, it's going to be 20 years ago. And they said, well, we're the #1 rated news talk in America. 2554. And I went, come on. Yeah, you know me, Rick. I'm a stats guy. I am a numbers guy. I was like,
Yeah, at that point, you're
come on.
saying we're not bigger than New York or LA or
Well,
right,
KMOX.
right.
KMOX in St. Louis with its reach and talking about shares even in New York, you're going to have it divided up because they have two or
Yeah, that's
three
competitive.
news
Yeah,
right,
yeah, yeah.
and LA, some of those are all news. You know what I mean? Well, then I went and looked and I said, well, KMOX, and I'm going to make up numbers here, but generally, yeah, they had a 15 share at the time. That was 12 plus, and when you went 2554, they were like at a 5.4. Out of 100. So people who don't understand this, out of 100 of the number of radio sets that are tuned in at any given time. Whereas WSB was like an 11, 2554. Theirs were 45 plus. All of the other news talks in America, their numbers were coming from 40 plus, whereas we had huge success in the 25 to 40 range, as well as the 40 plus was, or really 45 plus was almost a default for a news talk during that time. It was a monster. The rates we charged. I'll tell you a quick anecdote. Every year, the radio and records, or radio inside radio, one of the industry magazines, pardon me, would print who had billed the most money that year and the top 10 radio stations. And it was always WTOP in Washington, number one, all news, monster station, phenomenally run station for 30 years at least up there. So TOP, and then it'd be New York, LA, Chicago, LA, New York, LA, right? In the top 10. And I'll never forget one day our sales manager, Dan Carney, looking to go in, well, we beat that. And I said, how come we're not listed? Because we were privately held. They got all those numbers, and we were actually the number one billing station in America, AM or FM, and definitely in the top five for about 15 years, and number one like 3 out of 5 years, with as much money as we were billing. That station was a monster.
Well, I mean, again, growing up in Atlanta, WSB was just part of our lives.
Yes.
I mean, I can, my grandparents lived across the street from us in Avondale, and every Christmas Eve they would take us to see the lights at the governor's mansion.
Uh-huh.
And I figured it out later on. That's when our folks would get the toys out and put them together and all that. So, I mean, but we would follow Santa on WSB. We're tracking Santa around the world.
Oh, yes.
And so I can remember as a very small child thinking WSB, I mean, in my naive way, only WSB had Santa's tracking.
Tracking.
I didn't think any other station in the world had it. WSB had it. And then being the flagship station for the university, made it, such a power. And then being 50,000 watts. I mean, it just was a juggernaut. And with the demise of a lot of AM stations, it has remained still because of the iconic way it played a role, not only in Atlanta, but in the state and in the Southeast and everywhere else. I can remember being in high school in Kansas City and being able to listen to WSB at night.
Yeah.
Because you could pick it up. And then
you could hear us in 38 states and I think 5 different countries, because Cuba and a few others.
Right.
At night. But not anymore. Not with the LED lights. There's so many LED lights that now the 50,000 watt clear channel stations, for those of you who are not radio savvy, that means the 50,000 watters that don't turn down at night. A lot of radio stations, especially people who are older, you're driving along at sundown, and all of a sudden the station loses a lot of its power and you can't hear it necessarily. Well, there are about 30, I'll go round it off to 35 radio stations that don't have to do that are at 50,000 watts clear channel, because that was part of the national really security, alarm service.
Exactly. It was done for defense purposes and
purposes.
disaster purposes, that they knew they could reach people everywhere. In case of, because remember, we're growing up in the atomic age when we're all fearing that an atomic bomb might fall somewhere, and we need to be able to. I mean, that was real in that era.
It was actually pre-atomic, because it happened in the 30s when these stations got their designations, just in case we were invaded.
Yeah. Because
in case we were invaded, you knew in Kansas, they've landed on the beaches of San Diego.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you had to do that. You had to turn down all the other ones so that these guys wouldn't have interference. You'd be able to hear it out in the hinterlands of the Midwest, really.
Well, again, I grew up in Atlanta before the Braves. We had the Atlanta Crackers, our AAA team. So I love baseball. I as a child was a Chicago White Sox fan because I could pick up WLS in Chicago and listen to baseball games on my little transistor radio under the covers when I was supposed to be asleep. And so, I know there are a lot of people out there saying, what are you talking about? But it was a big phenomenon. But you, working at WSB, worked at an interesting time that you've got, again, the traditional media at Cox, print, you've got radio, AM and FM, you got a television station, but now we start this thing called the internet.
Oh yeah.
And talk about how that changed from the inside of an organization.
Well, incredibly. I guess one of my funny stories is always, I'm not exactly at the forefront of technology. Okay. And at one point we decided that, first of all, I remember when the general manager of the station put out a memo. One went into everybody's cubby, and it said, I want you to sign your name and tell me whether or not you think we should invest in getting email, internal email, and the vote was like 60-40 in favor. People are like, oh, well, we don't want that. I don't want that. And then, not long after, we decided we needed our own websites, which were very rudimentary. And he said, we had a little side company, Cox Interactive Media, which was going to help hire the people to build the websites and then direct the 110 radio stations and 18 TV stations and 5 newspapers rounding there that Cox owned around the country. And here's how you're going to do it. And the boss said to me, I'm going to have those people report to you at the WSB people for the website producer. I said, I can barely turn on my own computer. Why me? And he said, well, I need somebody who can manage people. The people out of corporate are going to hire your people for you, and then you're going to manage them and learn about the business, which I did, to an extent. But it was really pretty incredible. We did tons of research, which Cox has always been known for its research. There's a reason that still the Cox stations do so well compared to the behemoths, Clear Channel and Cumulus and some of those. If you look in the Cox markets, where those different people have 8 stations each and Cox has 6 or, 7 or 4 of the top 7 are going to be Cox stations. They just do well because we invest in research and record research. And I was a big part of that. I was a research person for many, many years, as you know. And we researched what people would want out of a website for the different radio stations. And then we developed particular websites for some of our personalities on WSB. Neil Bortz, who, for those of you who don't know who Neil was, he's still alive. He's just hasn't been active as a broadcaster for about 15 years. He was really Rush Limbaugh before Rush Limbaugh in Atlanta. So more of a libertarian than a Republican per se. But, he and Rush ended up having a great relationship. So he was huge. And then a guy named Clark Howard, who a lot of people nationally will know because he is Clark.com is his website, where he tells me he does better on his website than he ever did in radio, TV, and newspaper combined. And he got paid a lot of money by Cox for radio, TV, and newspaper combined, plus a syndicated radio show. He got paid a lot of money. and his website is fantastic now. So we developed things like that, and I was running that, and that included newsletters that would go out to the constituents. So, the Bortz people would get whatever they got from him, this bit and that bit, and then some opinions he may have had once a week or every 2 weeks. And that just began to grow more and more. At the same time, we had streaming, which, some people would do on their computers. It was very rudimentary when we're talking about the late 1990s and participation by people. But Rick, the one story I remember the most is the Braves. I was running all of the Atlanta Braves, Atlanta Hawks, Atlanta University of Georgia basketball, and football, and one other network. I forgot. Oh, and the Falcons for a while, and Georgia Tech for a while. And the Braves, with whom I had a tremendous relationship, asked me to come over and speak to their staff because they had heard me speak to clients about how great the Braves and what their run there was during the 90s into the 2000s and how unique it was in Major League history. Well, one of the questions that their staff asked me, they're about 100, 120 people, asked me, this at 6:00, and they fed everybody, was, are you worried about Pandora and satellite, XM Sirius? Pandora hadn't come yet. Are you worried about XM Sirius? I said, nah. And they were like, why? And I explained to them that Sirius XM, they were two separate companies then, said, look, they have to shoot rockets, hydrogen fuel propelled rockets into the air to launch their satellites. That's a huge overhead, right? They're going to take their share of stuff, but the radio would survive that. And they said, oh, okay. I said, but what scares me is, again, about 1999, 2000, I said, is the day, and I had a flip phone, is the day they figure out how to put all of that through this. Because the day they figure out how to put it through the phone, I don't know if radio will last a year.
Well, we're seeing a transformation, in the college sports world, well, in just the world of getting information. We lived in an affiliate world with ESPN having to distribute their stuff through Time Warner Cable or Xfinity or Dish or Direct, and they needed volume. And so every school mattered. Wake Forest mattered as much as Clemson. Vanderbilt mattered as much as Georgia. But in a direct-to-consumer world, what matters is the size of your tribe and the passion of your tribe, because you're going to monetize your tribe differently. And that's why the big boys are going to remain the big boys, just on sheer volume alone of fan base. Because you're going to subscribe to Georgia football, and you're going to pay whatever it takes to get Georgia football, and you're going to get it through your phone, and you're going to get it on. So there's seismic changes, but Cox navigated those changes probably as well as anybody in the country. And again, you talked about the research, but staying ahead. I've always said leaders see more and see before. And I think somebody ought to write the book of that era and how the story of Cox Communications and the decisions that they made to continue to be a market leader and continue to stay a market leader.
Yeah. And they also punted when it was time to punt.
Yeah, and
right?
You know what?
I mean, sold off the radio and TV,
right?
And sold off the newspaper too late. The newspapers,
right?
And they knew that. And then the time came with radio, TV, and they sold it off. And it was a brilliant move. And now they've just, quote, merged with Charter in cable, and it's keeping the Cox name, but Charter is, to my understanding, the majority partner. And just ask Ted Turner what that means when you merge with somebody.
Right. You
right?
Lose, you're right. You lose complete control and all that. I want to switch gears for a minute.
Yeah.
You have a very talented daughter that I think. I've done a lot of work in country music. She's really, really good.
Thank you.
But there's so much again, Charlotte and I talk about this all the time. How does one person make it and another one not make it? Because we've heard songwriters in the songwriter series sometimes that were like, my God, that's better than the guy that recorded the song. But they didn't make it. And so y'all have lived that kind of, you've lived in what I call the high. I mean, she played the Grand Ole Opry. That had to be.
She played CMA Fest. She played Nissan Stadium.
Right.
She opened for Shania Twain on tour.
Yeah, those kind of highlights. But it's a hard business, isn't it? I mean.
Yeah, that's a brutal business. Her name is Lily Rose, for those of you who don't know. And, there might be one or two people out there going, oh, yeah, I know her. It's funny when, that happens, right? Like, oh, yeah, well, that's my kid. Or they'll go, that's your daughter? And, Lily, she's done a great job of navigating all of that. She literally burned the boats. She left, she pretended to go to college for 4 years and actually went for like 2 and, in Athens not at UGA, but at North Georgia University and, North Georgia College, whatever it's called, pardon me, and honed her craft there playing open mic nights. And then at one of the open mic nights at one of the bars, the guy said, who are you? She told him, and he said, you're really good. I want you to play here one night a week. So he hired her to play Thursday nights, and she put together a little band, and it's had, a million iterations since then. And when it was time, she felt it was time, she moved to Nashville. And I'll never forget asking her, what's your backup plan? She said, there is no backup plan. I'm going to do this.
Part of the boat.
And, and there are plenty of stories out there of people who say, well, if it doesn't work after 6 months and the mentor says, go home now, because if you have a backup plan, you're not fully committed.
Yeah.
And she's done well. She's done well.
No, she really has, and she's really good. I think she's really, really talented. The other thing I wanted to talk about, I know what your day job was, but you had the fun job of hosting the Georgia Bulldog pregame show for a long time.
Still do.
At a great time of Georgia football. I mean, so you've been, so talk about that, because that's a fun gig, and that's a fun, and Georgia is still, Athens is a distance from a lot of the fans. And so a lot of people either are driving to Athens and listening to the early pregame show, or they're already tailgating and listening to the pregame show. So talk a little bit about that experience, because that's fun.
Well, it's a dream come true, to broadcast for your alma mater. And then for your alma mater to be really good for most of those years, and in recent years been sensational, has been fantastic. 1993, they had an opening to co-host the tailgate show with my longtime partner, Lauren Smith, and I jumped at the chance. Again, was working WSB and marketing and sports marketing and running networks and relationships with teams and radio station marketing and websites and all that crap. And then on the weekends, doing Georgia football. So I started in 1993. This will be my 34th season, coming up in about, 59 days or so. And I can't wait. And, I worked with Larry Munson, who was a legendary announcer for the Bulldogs for about 43 years. Larry and I worked together for 15 of them, his last 15, and developed a very close relationship. I can tell you that when Larry went into the College Football Hall of Fame broadcasters wing, and it's now based in Atlanta, as you know, Rick, but back then it was based in South Bend. And I'm the person he asked to come up with him.
Oh, wow. That is
to join him
special.
For his induction.
Well, you mentioned Lauren. I can remember all the times that Larry go, Lauren, what do you got?
Yeah.
Because he would be the sidelines and, and had such a great relationship with Coach Dooley. And so he was always getting kind of some, what I called insider information. And so that, Lauren, what do you got? You were listening. Well, Lauren, what do you got? Yeah.
No telling what Lauren was going to come back with.
Well, that's true. That's true. But it was, it was really kind of an interesting time. I'll tell a funny story. Georgia Tech's longtime announcer was a guy named Al Serrato, as you know, and you dealt with him, and
who I worked with for a year.
Exactly. And I was the basketball coach at Swanee, and my dad could do a really mean, like you do Andy Rooney, he could do a mean Al Seraldo invitation, and it's like Monday morning at, I don't know, 6:30 in the morning. I'm up at Swanee, and I answer the phone, and he goes, "Coach Jones, Al Seraldo." And I go, "Dad, I had a rough weekend. I'll call you back." And I hung up. And I laid there for a minute, and I thought, "Oh shit, we play Georgia Tech Wednesday night." And fortunately, he called me back. "Coach
Oh my
Jones?"
God.
Yes. And I said, "Al, I'm sorry." And I told him the story. He loved the story,
Oh,
because
of course.
my dad had gone to Tech, was a big Tech fan, a big Al Seraldo fan. So I told him the story. But I hang up on Al Seraldo the week of the Swanee Georgia Tech basketball game.
Nice.
I
Nice.
thought it was my dad busted my chops at 6:30 in
That's
the
really
morning.
funny.
Yeah.
I see Al Seraldo Jr. every year when we play Tech. He is still a spotter for Tech, and we've had a great. He's a Lakeside guy, another DeKalb County guy like you and I are, and our arch rivals, and he is really good friends with a lot of my old street hockey teammates. So
Well,
great.
I mean, again, we're in such a different era. When I grew up in Atlanta, freshmen were ineligible, and we had the classic Bull Pups versus the Baby Jackets football game on Thanksgiving Day that benefited, Scottish Rite Hospital every year, and that was a big deal. You wanted to know who's a freshman at Georgia that's going to be playing as a sophomore that we haven't heard about, and so things change. I mean, I try to remind my generation, you can either be a curmudgeon or you can embrace the changes, but not every change has been good. And I think baby boomers still have a lot of wisdom and stuff. So I always like to close with my guests. You're not done yet. What's on your bucket list that you still want to do?
Well, I've written a screenplay, and I finished that about 6 or 7 years ago, and I'm hoping to someday get that made. I've had a couple of real life people look at it. They weren't interested, but um, on the advice of a professor from the University of Georgia journalism school, who Lauren, my broadcast partner, set me up with, he gave me the name of a woman out at UCLA who teaches screenwriting, graduate screenwriting, and I paid her to read the screenplay, and she read it and had very few changes and said, "This is great. How many have you written?" And I said, "Well, this is the first one." And she said, "This is your first screenplay?" I said, "Yeah." And she was like, I thought you knew how to write a screenplay." I said, "No, I just bought the software." And she said, "Yeah, but your flow and your tempo." I said, "I watch a lot of TV. What can I tell you?" So I'm hoping on that. I have really a TV show I want to write, another movie, and 2 or 3 books that I want to write. So those are all in the bucket list, and continue to do Georgia football. And I retired from my day job 5 months ago, so chase Lily around the country. We like to go out and see her live. Flew to Detroit on her spring leg of the tour.
What a great way to see the country and see her and see audiences. I love
Yeah.
that. I think that's such a great job. I've got a few books in me that I'm trying to do, and I actually have written, almost completed a Broadway play
Wow.
it's about a R&B singer from the 1950s and 60s named Jackie Wilson, who was an interesting character. His story has never really been told, and one of the great stories was somebody at one time said to Elvis, "Well, Jackie Wilson is the black Elvis," and Elvis said, "Son, you have it totally wrong. Elvis is the white Jackie Wilson." And so it's fun. So I love the fact that you've got a bucket list and you're looking to do some things over the next few years of your life. So
Yeah.
you
Got a
better,
long way to go, Rick. Got a
yeah,
long way to go. Baby.
exactly. I tell people all the time, I got a really easy test for you. Just reach up here, and if you feel a pulse, God ain't finished with you. You got more to do. And let's do that. Listen, you've been a great friend for a long time, longer than we care to admit, and I can't thank you enough for being my guest today on Shaboom. It's now time for the boom. You remember when you actually could trust the media? Remember when if Walter Cronkite said it was true, or Chet Huntley, or David Brinkley, or somebody like Peter Jennings? Let me ask you today, who do you trust? I'm not sure I trust any of them. And that's the boom. It's now time to take a trip down memory lane. I remember 3 great movies about the media. I'm a big movie guy. My son, who's a filmmaker, and we've been to gazillions of movies together and have enjoyed movies over the years. Here are 3 about the media that I hope you'll remember too. The first one was called All the President's Men. It was a book written by Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were reporters for the Washington Post that broke the great Watergate story. Well, the movie version had Robert Redford playing Bob Woodward and Dustin Hoffman playing Carl Bernstein. Great movie. Hal Holbrook was in it. Jason Robards played Ben Bradley, who was the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post. The Post was a huge, probably the national paper, even bigger, in my opinion, than the New York Times, because the Post was all about politics and all about Washington, D.C. Great movie, All the President's Men, about the fall of Richard Nixon with Watergate. There was another movie called Network, kind of a spoof, but oh my goodness, did it turn out to be so true today with our sensationalism in television. Network was about a aging anchor man played by Peter Finch who was losing ratings and was about to be fired. And one day he went kind of nuts during the broadcast and told everybody across America that things were bad, and I want you all to go to your windows and open your windows, and I want you to scream, I'm mad as hell and I'm not taking it anymore. And thousands and thousands and thousands of people went out and started screaming, and they suddenly realized there's something. It became even more crazy because they had him assassinated, literally killed on television for ratings. Peter Finch died before a Network came out. He won the Academy Award as Best Actor posthumously, one of the few that have ever done that. Great movie. And finally, one of my favorite movies is a thing called Broadcast News. Broadcast News, great film. It was about the makings of network television. Albert Brooks played a character that was the hard-working reporter. You know, the guy that always worked hard to find the story and get that. But his problem was when he got on television, he perspired like crazy. I mean, he just sweated bullocks. William Hurt was the handsome anchor man, pretty shallow, but could read a teleprompter. And then Holly Hunter was kind of the in between both of them, the female lead. William Hurt, great actor, but played this shallow character. But he had this scene where he turned to Albert Brooks one day and he said, what happens when your life turns out even better than you ever imagined? And Albert Brooks said, you keep it to yourself. It's one of my favorite movies and one of my favorite scenes in all of that. And that's the trip down memory lane with 3 great media movies. It's time to get back on the road with Rick. You know, over my career, I've spent a lot of time in New York because I worked with the media, with meetings at CBS or ABC or ESPN or Turner Broadcasting or, you know, really New York remains the center of the media advertising world. The commercial value of media is still based in New York because of so many media buying agencies there, media creative agencies, and just the fact that so many networks are based there. And there's so many great places to eat in New York. I mean, where would you start? But one of my favorites is a place called Patsy's. Patsy's is on 56th Street at 8th Street, 56th and 8th, old style Italian restaurant, one of the greats. It was Sinatra's favorite, great place. And it was one of Tony Bennett's favorite places. And several years ago, I took my mom and my aunt and Charlotte. We went to New York for a trip. And, you know, it's funny, my mom and my aunt were acting very old that week. I mean, they were, it's like, you got to kind of hurry across the street. You get run over, let's kind of moving on. And they were kind of cranky and kind of old and kind of all this. But I took them to Patsy's, okay? And we literally were at a hotel across the street from Patsy's. So it wasn't much of a walk across the street, but we got them across the street. We came, so they took us upstairs. And I said to Mom and my Aunt June, I said, Tony Bennett eats here a lot. Well, we ate our dinner and all that. And we came downstairs, and who walks in? Tony Bennett. He walks in. He's wearing a yellow cashmere sport coat. Never forget. Suddenly, my mom and my aunt turned 16. Oh, Mr. Bennett. Oh, yeah. They're competing against one another for Tony Bennett's affections as he's trying to be seated for his dinner. But let me tell you about Tony Bennett. He was so kind. He was kind to them. These were his generation. And he was just remarkable in his just kindness and charisma to my mom and my aunt. And so we saw the great Tony Bennett at Patsy's. Go to Patsy's and eat in New York, y'all. Classic Italian food and really, really good food on the road with Rick. It's time for today's last word. We talked about movies earlier. There's one more movie about the media that I absolutely love. And it's not necessarily about the media, but it's about the power of the media. It's this classic movie called It Can Happen to You. Nicolas Cage plays a police officer. He's married, he's a police officer, and he goes to this diner regularly for lunch. And the waitress there is played by Bridget Fonda, Peter Fonda's daughter, Henry Fonda's granddaughter. Well, he doesn't have tip money. He doesn't have tip money. He tells her, I tell you what, I don't have the tip money, but I bought a lottery ticket. And if I win the lottery, I'll split it with you. Well, we know the story. He wins it, and he splits it with her. Well, ultimately, his wife sues him for divorce. They get an attorney. She gets all the money. Neither one of them get any of the money. They've fallen in love. They're devastated. Well, there's a character played by the great Isaac Hayes. Isaac Hayes, you may remember him, a great soul singer, recorded on Stax Records out of Memphis. Probably the most famous song that he did was a thing called Shaft, the theme song to the movie Shaft. Isaac Hayes, great performer. He plays a guy that looks like a street person who's really a reporter for the newspaper. And so he goes out and looks like a bum and is able to take pictures of people because they don't know he's a reporter. And he ends up taking pictures of them and writing this story about how even though they've lost everything, including the diner, they found love with each other. Well, the thing is so powerful that people send in donations and they get hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy the diner back. And it's a great movie. And it's a great movie about, decency and positivity in the media. There was a guy named Monty Laurel at USA Today who I got to be friends with. And he was a sports editor. And I went to Monty one time and I said, and this is back when USA Today was the power. I mean, it was the national paper. And it had 4 sections. It's published Monday through Friday: news, business, sports, arts. 4 sections. I went to Monty and I said, you ought to take the back page of each of those sections on Friday and write nothing but positive stories. Stories about news, stories about people in the arts doing great work, sports people doing great work, business people doing great work. He said nobody would read it. I said, it'll be the most read page every week. They didn't do it. They should have. Because people they get enough bad news. It's kind of nice to have some good news. So that's the last word today. Thanks to my old friend Neil Williamson for being my guest, and to you, the listener, for joining us today. And we're going to see you back here next week for another edition of Shaboom.